we have reached the end of our ecology unit, and so I wanted to kind of do a crash course on all of the main topics for you to review before, keyword, before you take your quizzes over this unit. Okay, so remember, ecology is the study of the relationships between biotic and abiotic factors in the environment. Okay, and so we remember eco means home. Okay, and so we're looking at these organisms and their homes, habitats, niches, and the ology means the study of. So we're looking at the study of the homes and environments of different organisms. So a nice little refresher of the levels of organization. So we're going to start at a cell. We're not going to go all the way to atoms and molecules right now, but remember, cells build up, and because they are the smallest unit of living things, build up to make our tissues, which is a group of cells organized together to work together. Those tissues are going to build organs, which are different kinds of tissues working together. They then make the organ systems, groups of organs working together. Organ systems come together to make an organism. Organisms of the same species make up a population. A community are all the interacting populations, so different species coming together. The ecosystem is all the non-living and living things interacting in a certain area. So these are all the abiotic and biotic factors. And then we talked about biomes for a little bit, the large region that's going to encompass all the different types of ecosystems in the world. All right, so in an ecosystem, remember there are living things and there are non-living things in the environment. So these are going to include the abiotic and biotic factors. Remember, biotic factors are the living parts of an ecosystem. The abiotic factors are the non-living parts of an ecosystem. Okay, so some examples of biotic factors would be like the vegetation and trees, fungus, and of course organisms, animals of any sort. All right, examples of abiotic factors are things like fire, the sun, rocks, air, so things like that. Okay, so we're going to move on. Like I said, a little crash course of all the main topics here are food chains. So nice little food chain there. So these are, sorry, brain fart. So food chains use arrows to show the flow of energy in an ecosystem. Okay, so these arrows are always going to point to the organism that is doing the eating. So here we have an example of a plant being eaten by an insect who is eaten by a mouse who is then eaten or devoured by an owl. Okay, and so we have producers, consumers, and then the different types, the herbivores, omnivores, carnivores. Okay, so anything that can make its own food to survive is called a producer. Okay, so those are mainly our plants and algae that are utilizing photosynthesis to get their own food supply. Anything that cannot make its own food must eat to survive, and so these are called consumers. So then we talked about trophic levels. Okay, trophic levels of an organism indicates the position that the organism occupies in that food chain. So it shows what it eats and what eats it. Okay, so in the trophic levels of a food chain, you start down here at producers. Remember, they're making their own food. And the first organisms, which are usually the herbivores, are going to eat the producers, and they are called primary consumers. Okay, primary consumers are then consumed by secondary consumers because they are coming second in line. And so they're going to eat these primary consumers, so they can be carnivores, meaning they just eat primary consumers, or omnivores, where they're eating the animals and plants. And then finally, you have the tertiary consumers that eat primary consumers, also eat secondary consumers, and as well, they can be omnivores, meaning they eat both plants and animals, or they can be carnivores and just eating animals. So here's a nice little diagram here of what these guys look like based off of a pyramid. Okay, so producers are at the bottom, and you can see there's plenty of them. Primary consumers are the second level, secondary consumers are the third level, tertiary consumers are the fourth level, and we talked a little bit about decomposers early on in our unit, and they're the ones that will go in and feed off of the decaying matter to recycle everything in our nice little circle of life. Now, in all of those food chains, we put them together and those make up a food web, okay? And so you have different interactions with different animals, so it's not just a straight arrow to the owl. As you can see, there are different types of ways that the owl is getting its nutrition. Okay, so you have the grass, the producer. You can have the grasshopper as a consumer herbivore. You have the snake and the weasel with its prey. So there are different ways that we can get this food, all these food chains, to turn into a food web, as you can see here. So energy pyramids, remember, even though we have all these food chains making up a food web, the energy pyramid is actually going to show the amount of energy that is going to move from one trophic level to another in a food chain. And remember, the most energy is going to be available at the producer level because producers are producing their own food. So they're not having to utilize energy or consume their energy as much as the other organisms in the food chain. So the availability of energy in that case is going to decrease as it moves up because these animals are having to utilize the energy for metabolism. Some of it gets lost through the process of heat transfer and things like that. So remember, down here, the producers, say if we had 1,000 kilocalories, we then would only have 100 kilocalories at the primary consumer, 10 at the secondary, and only 1 at the tertiary. And remember, this is what we call that base rule of 10. Only 10% of the energy is being passed on to the next level. Okay, so going back to biotic factors. Biotic factors also talk about how organisms interact with each other. And so we call these things the symbiotic relationships. Okay, and so some of the key ones are parasitism, mutualism, and competition. We're going to talk about commensalism, predation as well. Okay, so these things look like, wait for it, like so. So the first one, parasitism. This is where one organism is going to benefit, which is the parasite, while the other is harmed, and that is the host. Okay, so here are some examples: mosquitoes, ticks, fleas, leeches. You can all see they're all going to benefit from their host, which is sometimes us, and dogs, cats, things like that, and in the process they're harming those organisms. Commensalism is one organism is benefiting while the other is not affected. Okay, so some examples here are like the barnacles on a whale. Okay, the whale is not affected by the fact that these barnacles have attached themselves to it, but they get a nice little habitat and they get basically a free ride for food. The same thing here. These fish are going to feed off of the algae and other matter that's on the shell of the turtle. The turtle doesn't even mind it. We have mutualism, where both organisms are going to benefit in these environments. Okay, so again, we have the bee and the flower. The bee gets its nutrition from the flower gets pollinated in the process. Okay, so little things like that. We have the clownfish, is safe from the sea anemone, and the sea anemone is there for its benefit as well. Okay, so last topic is those limiting factors, and we just had a nice little activity, the lesson of the K-Bob, to kind of go over these limiting factors and carrying capacities. All right, so limiting factor is either an abiotic or a biotic factor that's going to restrict the number of individuals in a population. Okay, and so these things can vary in terms of what they are. And so here's a list of some of the limiting factors that can be included. So things like competitors, disease and parasites, weather, fires, available habitat, and predators. All of these things kind of encompass limiting factors in a ecosystem. And the reason why we have these limiting factors can also be the cause and reason for the carrying capacity. And so remember, in a habitat, The carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals of a species that an ecosystem can support. Remember, if there are too many organisms of that species in that habitat, remember they are going to start dying off, okay, because there's not enough resources to be able to hold and withstand all of those individuals in an ecosystem. And then we talked a little bit towards the middle about succession. And so I wanted to put in the succession chart for you to have a side-by-side comparison as you are doing this, going through this review. Okay, so remember, primary succession is beginning basically with rock. Okay, there's no life to begin with. And so there's no soil present. And this is generally a new area, so after a volcanic eruption. And what's going to come first is that lichen and moss. And so primary succession, in order to get that climax community, it's going to take a really long time because it's building pretty much from scratch. Whereas secondary succession, this is following the removal of an existing habitat. Okay, there's soil already present. This is in an old area, so this is usually after some sort of natural disaster. So whether it's a brush fire or, deforestation, things like that. So seeds and roots are already present, and so they are just re-blossoming in that area. Okay, so like I said, a nice little crash course of everything that we talked about. You can watch this video as many times as you'd like prior to doing your quizzes for this unit. So hopefully you enjoyed. Where did it go?